The sun was shining bright over the quiet, upscale neighborhood. Laughter echoed across the perfectly trimmed lawns as a group of women gathered on a porch, sipping tea and trading stories about designer bags, holiday villas, and their husbands' promotions. In the middle of their cheerful chatter stood Emma, a woman in plain clothes, hair tied back in a simple bun, and a warm but quiet smile. She was holding a tray of refreshments, gently placing cups on the table. To them, she was just a maid. One of the women, Olivia, smirked and leaned in closer to the others. Honestly, I don't know why Caroline even lets her stay during the parties. It's not like she's one of us. Maybe she enjoys pretending, laughed Grace, stirring her tea. Probably dreams of being rich one day. Emma heard the whispers. She always did. She never reacted. She kept her head down, serving tea, picking up used plates, blending into the background like wallpaper. They didn't know her story and they never cared to ask. She was just a help in their eyes. But then, just as the laughter grew louder, a low hum began to ripple through the air. The sound grew stronger, closer. Heads turned upward. A helicopter appeared above the tree line, circling once before descending toward the open clearing behind the house. The women froze, eyes wide with disbelief. Who arrives at a neighborhood tea party in a helicopter? The chopper landed gracefully, the blade still spinning as a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out. He looked around, then began walking purposefully toward the group. Toward Emma, the women stood frozen, their laughter fading into silence. All eyes were on the man stepping out of the helicopter, the wind from the blades whipping their hair and fluttering their expensive scarves. He looked completely out of place in the quiet suburb, tall, polished, and with an aura that commanded attention. His expensive shoes touched the ground lightly, but his gaze was firm and searching. Then, without a word, he walked straight past the stunned guests and stopped in front of Emma. There was a pause. No one spoke. Emma looked up slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. A quiet smile played on her lips, the kind that held years of secrets. The man reached out his hand and said softly, "Sorry I'm late." In that moment, the world seemed to stop. The women stared wide-eyed, unable to process what they were seeing. How could someone like her be connected to someone like him? Before anyone could gather the courage to ask, the man gently took Emma's hand, and the two stood there side by side, like equals. But behind the calm surface, emotions swirled. The judgment, the gossip, the years of quiet mockery. Emma had heard it all. And now, here she was, holding hands with the man everyone now realized was more than just successful. He was powerful, but who was he really? And how did someone like Emma end up married to a man who clearly belonged to a different world? As the guests tried to collect themselves, whispers began again, but this time, they were filled with curiosity and confusion, not laughter. One woman leaned over to another and asked, "Do you think she was pretending to be poor?" Another scoffed, "Maybe she married into money and stayed a maid to spy on us." The theories grew wilder by the second, but Emma said nothing. She didn't owe them an explanation. The truth was far more complicated. Emma hadn't married into wealth for money. She and her husband had known each other long before the riches, before the success. Their story was one of struggle, loyalty, and deep love, something that couldn't be bought or faked. He had built his empire with her by his side, through late nights and early mornings, through sacrifice and quiet victories no one had seen. But Emma never chased status. She chose to live simply, stay grounded, and continue working, not because she had to, but because she wanted to remain close to real people, to stay humble. Still, none of that was clear to the women watching. To them, it was a mystery, one that only deepened when Emma turned to her husband and said just 4 words, leaving everyone hanging in stunned silence. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a quiet storm. "We need to talk." Her voice was calm, steady, but there was something behind it. Her husband nodded without question, his hand still holding hers as he followed her away from the crowd. The women, still too stunned to speak, watched them go with wide eyes and racing thoughts. Some looked embarrassed, others defensive, but all of them were burning with curiosity. The woman they had mocked had just shattered every assumption they'd made, and now, Something even deeper seemed to be unfolding. Inside the house, Emma led her husband to the back garden, away from the watching eyes. He looked at her, concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat down on the edge of a stone bench and took a long breath. "Do you know how long I've been quiet?" she finally said. "How many times I've heard people laugh at me, talk down to me, treat me like I don't matter." He reached for her hand again, but she gently pulled away, not out of anger but out of pain. There was a silence between them, not cold, but full of weight. "I didn't come here to feel important," she continued. "I just wanted to stay real, to remember where we came from. But today something changed." While they spoke, the scene outside had shifted. Some of the guests were leaving, clearly uncomfortable. Others stayed behind, gathering in tense little circles, whispering theories. One woman, Sarah, who had once been closest to Emma when they were younger, stood silently by the hedge, her face pale. She hadn't recognized her old friend until now. Years had passed since they last spoke, but recognition had finally settled in. Guilt followed quickly elsewhere. One of the younger housekeepers, Lily, who had seen the entire moment unfold, was quietly inspired. She had always felt invisible, just like Emma, but today gave her something else: hope. Maybe there was more to people like them than what others chose to see. Back in the garden, Emma looked up. "They don't care who I really am," she said. "They only care now because of you. The helicopter, the money, but they don't see me." Her husband was silent. He knew she was right. And even though he had built a life of success, he realized he had missed something too. The hurt that came from being quietly judged day after day. The breeze picked up, carrying the noise of the still chattering guests. Emma stood slowly and looked back toward the house. Her next step would change everything, but not before the truth finally came out. Emma walked slowly back toward the house, her husband just a few steps behind. The silence between them wasn't angry, it was heavy with things unsaid. As they got closer, the crowd outside grew quieter. The energy had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Emma wasn't just a maid anymore. She had become the center of attention, not because of gossip, but because no one knew what she would do next. And in a place where image was everything, she had become the unexpected mirror. Inside the house, Sarah waited nervously near the kitchen doorway. Her heart was racing. She remembered Emma now, how they used to share stories in school, laugh during lunch breaks, talk about dreams and struggles. But life had pulled them apart. Sarah had chosen the fast lane: wealth, influence, appearances, while Emma had disappeared into the background. Or so she thought. When Emma stepped into the room, their eyes met. For a brief second, time rewound. The childhood connection flashed between them, but then faded as the weight of the present returned. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Emma looked past her. She wasn't ready, not yet. One of the hosts, an older woman named Mrs. Bennet, stepped forward with a forced smile. "Emma, dear," she said with a hint of unease, "why didn't you ever tell us who your husband was?" The question wasn't innocent. It carried an edge, as if Emma had been hiding something, as if it was her fault they had all been wrong. Emma looked around the room at the curious stares, the half smiles, the people pretending they hadn't laughed at her earlier. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked quietly. The question silenced even the whispers. From the back of the room, someone muttered, "We had a right to know." Another said, "This feels like a game." The tension grew, sharp and uncomfortable. Emma's husband stepped forward, but she gently held out her hand, stopping him. This was her moment. At that same time, Lily stood just outside the door, holding her cleaning cloth, heart pounding. She had seen everything, and now she watched Emma stand alone in a room full of people who had once dismissed her. Her quiet strength filled the space, but there was something in her eyes, a storm waiting to break. Emma looked up slowly, her voice calm but unshakable. "You think you know who people are," she said, "until they stop fitting into your idea of what's possible." The room went still, and then she reached into her bag. Everyone leaned in, waiting, watching. What she pulled out next would leave them speechless. From her worn leather bag, Emma slowly pulled out a folded envelope. It looked ordinary, no logo, No decoration, just a plain white envelope. But the way she held it, the way her fingers gripped it tightly, made everyone realize this wasn't just paper. It meant something. The room leaned in, eyes locked on her every move. She didn't rush. She looked around once more, then set the envelope gently on the table beside her. This, she said, her voice slow but clear, is the truth none of you ever bothered to ask about. A nervous shuffle moved through the crowd. Emma looked over at Mrs. Bennet, who stood stiffly with a confused smile. Years ago, Emma continued, I applied to work in this neighborhood not because I needed money, but because I needed peace. I wanted to step away from a world that only saw titles and bank balances. I chose this life on purpose. One woman laughed awkwardly. So you're saying you're rich but wanted to play poor? Emma didn't flinch. No, she replied. I wanted to feel real again. My husband built an empire. Yes, but I helped him build it every late night, every decision, every risk. But when it all became too loud, I chose a quiet life. I chose this. Then she looked down at the envelope. But I didn't come here today just to be mocked or pitied. I came to deliver this. Gasps rippled through the group. Whispers filled the air. Deliver what? Is she suing someone? Is this a setup? Her husband stepped forward finally, his face unreadable. Emma, he said quietly, you don't have to do this now. But she didn't stop. She turned to face Sarah. Their eyes met again this time, not with tension, but something deeper. Regret. Recognition. You remember when your father sold his land? Emma asked. Sarah's eyes widened. How do you? Emma nodded. It wasn't just any buyer. It was me. The room broke into shocked gasps again. Sarah looked like she'd seen a ghost. That land saved my family from going under, she whispered. You? It was you? Emma didn't answer directly. She placed the envelope in Sarah's hands. Everything you need to know is in there. The whispers turned into confusion. Now the crowd wasn't just curious, they were rattled, because, in a single moment, the woman they had dismissed as a maid had not only shaken their pride, she had rewritten their past. Sarah stood frozen, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. Her mind raced as she opened it slowly, eyes scanning the pages inside. The color drained from her face. It wasn't just a receipt or some forgotten document, it was the deed to her family's old property, along with a letter Emma had written years ago but never sent. In it, Emma explained how she had seen Sarah's family struggling, and how she had stepped in quietly through a third party to buy the land at a fair price well above market value so her old friend's family wouldn't lose everything. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma looked at her, calm and steady. Because it wasn't about being thanked. I just wanted to help. The way you once helped me when no one else did. But somewhere along the way, people forgot how to see me. The crowd around them was completely silent. The very same people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and whispered behind her back were now witnessing the strength of a woman they had never taken the time to know. And now, every assumption they'd made was shattered. Mrs. Bennet stepped forward, her tone softer now. Emma, we owe you an apology. But Emma shook her head gently. It's not about apologies. It's about remembering that kindness doesn't always come wrapped in status. And not everyone shows their worth in the way you expect. There was a long pause. Emma's husband put an arm around her shoulders, proud but quiet. It seemed like everything had finally settled. The room felt heavier, but also honest for the first time that day. People weren't pretending. Then, just as everyone thought the moment had passed, Emma turned to Sarah one last time. There's one more thing, she said, reaching into her bag once again. This time, she pulled out a worn photograph, faded, but still clear. Two teenage girls smiling, arms around each other. On the back, in old handwriting, were the words, no matter what, always sisters. Sarah covered her mouth, stunned. I thought I lost this. Emma nodded. You didn't. You just forgot where to look. And just like that, the real twist of the story unfolded, not about wealth or appearances, but about memory, friendship, and how sometimes the richest people are the ones you overlook. Sarah held the photograph tightly, tears falling freely now. Around her, The crowd had fallen completely silent, not out of shock anymore, but from something else: respect. A few people looked down, ashamed of the way they had treated Emma, realizing how quickly they had judged someone without knowing her story. The woman they thought was just a maid had shown more grace, strength, and loyalty than anyone else in the room. Emma gave Sarah a small smile, one that held both forgiveness and distance. Some things could be repaired, others simply accepted. But in that moment, something old and meaningful between them quietly found its place again. As the sun began to set outside, people started to leave, not with loud goodbyes or small talk, but with quiet steps and thoughtful glances. The tone had shifted completely. Some guests stopped to thank Emma, offering soft, genuine words. Lily, the young housekeeper, lingered behind and approached her shyly. "You don't know what today meant to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You made me feel seen." Emma placed a hand on her shoulder. "Never forget your worth, Lily. No job defines you. Only your heart does." Outside, the helicopter stood ready again, its blades silent now. Emma's husband offered her his arm. "Ready to go?" he asked gently. She looked back one last time at the house, the yard, and the fading chatter. "Yes," she said, but her voice was peaceful. "I've said everything I needed to." They walked toward the helicopter together, not in a rush, but steady. As they rose into the sky moments later, a few neighbors watched from their porches, no longer in judgment but in awe. Back on the ground, Sarah stood quietly, still holding the photo. She looked around her perfect world, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel so perfect anymore. She realized she had lost more than a friendship. She had lost the humility that once grounded her. In the end, Emma didn't leave as a woman who needed to prove anything. She left as herself, simple, strong, kind. And while she may have arrived in plain clothes, she walked away as someone unforgettable. Her story became something people in that neighborhood never forgot. A reminder that behind every quiet soul could be a past you know nothing about, a strength you didn't expect, and a life far richer than you ever imagined.